Sometimes losing everything you love can lead you to find what you never knew you needed. When grief drives you so far into the wilderness that civilization becomes just a memory, even the smallest act of mercy can change your life forever. Mountain man Elias Gray has been living alone in the Colorado Rockies for 7 years, haunted by the tragedy that took his family. On a bitter winter evening, he finds a wolf pup with a twisted leg, abandoned by its pack to die in the snow. As Elias holds the helpless creature, the pack's giant leader emerges from the trees. What happens between man and wolf in that moment will transform them both. But how can saving one small life heal wounds that have festered for years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat like a weathered scar against the white face of Mount Elbert, its log walls darkened by 7 winters of solitude. Smoke curled from the stone chimney into the crystalline air, the only sign of human presence in a landscape that stretched endlessly toward jagged peaks and pewter skies. Inside, Elias Gray moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned to waste nothing. Not wood, not warmth, not words. He had no one to share. At 52, his beard had gone mostly gray, and his hands bore the calluses of a life spent carving survival from unforgiving stone and timber. The wedding ring on his left hand caught the firelight as he stirred a pot of venison stew, a simple gold band that he still turned absently when memories threatened to surface. He'd worn it for 15 years of marriage and 7 years of mourning. Some habits, he'd learned, were harder to break than others. The cabin itself told the story of gradual withdrawal from the world. What had begun as a weekend hunting retreat had slowly transformed into permanent exile. Shelves that once held Sarah's books now contained only practical volumes: wilderness survival, veterinary care, weather patterns. The small bedroom where he and Sarah had planned to grow old together now served as storage for winter supplies. Emma's hand-carved wooden doll sat on the mantel, its paint faded and wood worn smooth by his fingers during the darkest nights. He'd made that doll during the winter before the fire, whittling away at mountain ash while Sarah read aloud from Emma's favorite stories. The little girl had named her Sunny because her painted dress was yellow, like the flowers that bloomed in their meadow each spring. Now Sunny watched over a cabin where spring flowers never grew, where laughter had died 7 years ago on a October night when everything changed. Elias had been 3 days into a hunting trip, guiding a wealthy Denver businessman through elk territory when the fire started. A faulty chimney flue, the investigators said later. Sarah and Emma never had a chance. By the time neighbors saw the flames, by the time the volunteer fire department made the 20-mile drive from town, there was nothing left but ash and the hollow echo of a life that would never be whole again. The guilt had eaten at him like acid. If he'd been home, if he'd fixed that chimney flue Sarah had mentioned the week before, if he'd chosen family over the money that hunting trip would bring. The ifs had driven him first to drink, then to rage, and finally to this, a self-imposed exile where the only sounds were wind and wildlife, where the only conversations were with ghosts. His veterinary degree gathered dust in a drawer, unused, since the day he'd walked away from his practice in Leadville. Dr. Elias Gray had once been known throughout the Arkansas Valley for his gentle way with injured animals, his ability to heal what others thought lost. But healing required hope, and hope had burned to ash along with everything else that mattered. The daily routine had become his anchor. Rise before dawn, check the weather, tend the fire, inspect the snares and hunting blinds that kept him fed through the endless winters. Repair what the wind and snow had damaged. Read by lamplight until exhaustion allowed sleep. Repeat. It was a life measured in surviving 1 day at a time, nothing more. Tonight felt different, though he couldn't name why. The wind carried a restlessness that made him step outside, despite the bitter cold. The thermometer beside the door read 12 below zero, and fresh snow had begun falling in the last hour. This was the kind of weather that killed the unprepared. that turned the mountains into a white wasteland where only the strongest survived. He was pulling on his heavy coat when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as wind through the pines. But there it was again, a thin whimpering that spoke of pain and desperation. Grabbing his flashlight and rifle, Elias stepped into the storm. The beam of his light cut through the swirling snow, illuminating the familiar landscape of his solitary domain. 50 yards from the cabin, near the creek that provided his water supply, something dark lay motionless in the snow. As he approached, the whimpering grew clearer, and his heart clenched with recognition. A wolf pup, perhaps 4 months old, lay on its side in the deepening snow. Its left hind leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, not from recent injury, but from birth. A malformation that would have marked it as weak in the harsh mathematics of pack survival. The little creature's ribs showed clearly through its winter coat, and its breathing came in shallow, desperate pants. Elias knelt beside the pup, his veterinary training automatically assessing its condition. Hypothermic, severely malnourished, the twisted leg preventing normal movement or hunting ability. In the wild, such animals rarely survived their first winter. The pack would have been forced to abandon it, unable to spare resources for a member who couldn't contribute to group survival. The pup's eyes opened as Elias reached toward it, golden eyes that held an intelligence and awareness that struck him like a physical blow. They reminded him of Emma's eyes in the moments before sleep, trusting and vulnerable, believing absolutely that the adults in her world would keep her safe. He'd failed Emma, he'd failed Sarah, but this small life, abandoned and dying in the snow, still drew breath, still fought against the cold that wanted to claim it. As Elias carefully lifted the pup, cradling its small body against his coat, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A low growl, deep and resonant, coming from the tree line behind him. He turned slowly, the pup pressed against his chest, and found himself face to face with the largest wolf he'd ever seen. The animal stood at the edge of his flashlight's beam, massive shoulders rigid with tension, yellow eyes reflecting the light like ancient amber. A scar ran across its muzzle, speaking of battles won and dominance earned. This was an alpha, a leader, and every instinct told Elias he was looking at the pup's father. Man and wolf regarded each other in the falling snow, the silence heavy with unspoken communication. The alpha could kill him, Elias had no doubt of that. But something in the great wolf's posture suggested not attack, but assessment, as if the creature was taking his measure, judging his intentions toward the small life he held. The pup whimpered against Elias's chest, and the alpha's ears flicked forward at the sound. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the three of them formed a tableau in the wilderness, man, wolf, and the fragile bridge of life between them. Then the alpha stepped back into the shadows, not retreating but watching, waiting to see what choice the human would make. Elias made his decision without conscious thought. The same instinct that had once driven him to heal wounded animals, overriding 7 years of isolation and grief. He turned toward his cabin, the pup's small heartbeat fluttering against his ribs, and walked slowly through the snow. Behind him, he felt the alpha's gaze like a weight between his shoulder blades, but no attack came, only the whisper of wind through pine needles and the soft crunch of snow beneath his boots as he carried the abandoned pup toward warmth and the possibility, fragile, as first light of purpose. Inside the cabin's warmth, Elias laid the wolf pup on a blanket near the fire, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of his veterinary past. The little creature's breathing was shallow and rapid, its body temperature dangerously low. As he examined the twisted hind leg, memories surfaced unbidden. Emma bringing him injured birds, rabbits caught in fencing, a raccoon kit orphaned by a car strike. "Can you fix him, Daddy?" She'd always asked, those golden eyes so similar to the pup's, now watching him with desperate hope. The deformity was congenital, the femur curved in a way that would never allow normal weight-bearing. In his practice, he might have recommended surgery, pins, and reconstruction that could give the animal mobility. Here, With only basic supplies and harsh mountain winters, the pup would need to adapt or perish. But adaptation, Elias knew, was possible with patience and care. He wrapped the small body in warm blankets, coaxing drops of water between its lips, feeling for the steady pulse that meant life still fought against the cold's embrace. The pup's fur was silver gray with darker guard hairs, marking it as likely the offspring of an alpha pair. Its bloodline was strong, which explained both its intelligence and the difficulty its pack would have had in abandoning it. A sound outside froze Elias mid-motion, the deliberate crunch of large paws in snow, circling the cabin with predatory precision. Through the window he caught glimpses of movement, shadows that resolved into the massive form of the alpha wolf. The animal was patrolling his territory, nose to the wind, reading scents that told him his offspring lived but remained in human hands. Elias reached for his rifle, then stopped. Something about the alpha's behavior spoke not of attack preparation, but of parental anxiety. The wolf's circuits around the cabin were methodical, but not aggressive, the pacing of a father waiting for news from a delivery room, powerless to help but unable to abandon his vigil. The pup stirred in its blankets, letting out a weak whimper that seemed to pierce the cabin walls. Outside, the alpha's pacing stopped abruptly. A long howl rose into the night, mournful and complex, carrying layers of meaning Elias couldn't translate but somehow understood. It was answered from the distance by other voices, the pack calling back to their leader, asking questions he couldn't yet answer. By morning, the pup had stabilized enough to take small amounts of warmed goat's milk from a makeshift bottle. Its eyes tracked Elias's movements with growing alertness, and when he spoke softly, the small ears swiveled toward his voice. The twisted leg remained useless, but the pup showed remarkable determination. Using its 3 good legs to drag itself closer to the fire's warmth, Elias named him Hope, not from sentimentality, but from recognition of what the small creature represented. After 7 years of merely surviving, of existing without purpose beyond drawing his next breath, he found himself invested in another being's future. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd fled human contact to escape the possibility of further loss, only to find himself caring for the most fragile life imaginable. The alpha returned with the dawn, positioning himself at the tree line where he could observe the cabin without approaching too closely. His massive frame remained motionless for hours, yellow eyes fixed on the windows behind which his offspring fought for life. Occasionally, other wolves appeared beside him, his mate, a smaller female with intelligent eyes, and 2 other pack members who showed by their posture that they accepted his authority without question. On the 2nd day, something remarkable happened. Elias had brought Hope outside for fresh air and sunshine, supporting the pup's weight while it attempted to navigate the snow with its 3 functional legs. The alpha watched from his usual position, but as the pup grew tired and began to struggle, the great wolf took a step forward, not an attack or threat, but something far more significant, a father's instinct to help his child. The movement was subtle, checked almost immediately, but it spoke volumes about the internal war raging within the pack leader. Love for his offspring warred with suspicion of the human who held his fate. Elias understood that delicate balance all too well. He'd once been torn between love and duty, between the safe choices that protected his family and the risks that provided for them. The hunting trip that had taken him away during the fire had been motivated by love. The money would have secured Emma's college fund, given Sarah the kitchen renovation she'd dreamed about. Instead, it had cost him everything, but perhaps understanding could bridge the gap between species. Moving slowly and deliberately, Elias sat in the snow with Hope in his lap, making himself small and non-threatening. He spoke in low, gentle tones, not words, but sounds of comfort and reassurance. The same voice he'd once used to calm frightened animals in his veterinary practice, the voice that had sung lullabies to Emma during thunderstorms. The alpha's ears pricked forward at the sound. His massive head tilted slightly, processing this new information about the human who held his child. For long minutes, the tableau held. Man and wolf separated by evolutionary divergence, but united in concern for the small life between them. Then the alpha did something that took Elias's breath away. He lay down in the snow, making himself less imposing, and released a soft woof of sound toward his pup. Hope's head lifted immediately, a tiny tail attempting to wag, despite the blankets that wrapped his small frame. The response was pure joy, a child recognizing his father's voice across an impossible divide. In that moment, Elias realized he wasn't stealing the pup from its family. He was being evaluated as a potential addition to it. The alpha wasn't abandoning his offspring to human care. He was considering whether this particular human might be worthy of trust. It was a test more profound than any examination he'd ever faced. Over the following days, the pattern established itself. The alpha maintained his vigil, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by his mate or other pack members. They brought no aggression, only watchful patience, as they observed Hope's progress under Elias's care. The pup grew stronger daily, his appetite improving, his mobility increasing as he learned to compensate for his disabled leg. But it was the moments of interaction that proved most significant. When Hope whimpered, the alpha would answer with soft vocalizations. When the pup showed excitement or joy, his father's posture would relax slightly, massive tail offering the barest suggestion of movement. A conversation was taking place across species lines, father and child maintaining their bond despite the unusual circumstances. Elias found himself included in these exchanges. When he spoke gently to Hope, the alpha's attention focused on him with laser intensity, reading body language and vocal tones for signs of threat or kindness. When he demonstrated care, feeding, warming, protecting the vulnerable pup, the great wolf's suspicion seemed to ease incrementally. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Hope had been attempting to follow Elias around the cabin, his determination to move, despite his disability, both heartbreaking and inspiring. But the effort exhausted the young wolf, and he collapsed in the snow outside the front door, whimpering with frustration at his body's limitations. Before Elias could move to help, the alpha was there. Not attacking, not threatening, but approaching with the careful deliberation of a parent coming to aid his child. The massive wolf stopped 3 feet from where Hope lay, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough to avoid startling the human. Elias held perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as the alpha lowered his great head and released a series of soft sounds, wolf words of encouragement and love that needed no translation. Hope responded immediately, struggling back to his feet with renewed determination, drawing strength from his father's presence. In that moment, looking into the alpha's intelligent yellow eyes, Elias understood that an agreement had been reached, not between human and animal, but between two beings who loved the same small life and were willing to work together to ensure its survival. The alpha was offering partnership, not surrender. He was sharing custody, not abandoning responsibility. It was trust of the most fundamental kind, the trust of a parent placing his child's welfare above his own fears and instincts. As snow began to fall again, covering the three of them in pristine white, Elias felt something he hadn't experienced in 7 years, the weight of responsibility for another's happiness, and the terrifying, wonderful possibility that he might not be alone anymore. The alpha held his gaze for one more moment, then turned and melted back into the forest. But the message was clear. He would be watching, waiting, and ready to trust as long as that trust remained deserved. For the first time since the fire, Elias Gray had been given the chance to be part of a family again, even if that family wore fur and spoke in howls under the endless mountain sky. The old veterinary supplies kit had sat unopened in Elias's closet for 7 years, gathering dust like everything else from his former life. Now, as he cleaned its contents and arranged them on his kitchen table, muscle memory guided his hands through familiar rituals. Antiseptic, gauze, small surgical instruments, syringes, and bottles of medication that had somehow survived their mountain exile. the tools of healing he'd sworn never to use again. Hope watched from his nest of blankets near the fire, golden eyes tracking every movement with the intensity that marked his wolf heritage. The pup's condition had stabilized, but his twisted leg required ongoing care to prevent muscle atrophy and joint stiffness. In his practice, Elias had treated similar conditions in domestic animals, but never in a wild creature whose survival would depend on adapting to permanent disability. "Easy now, little one," Elias murmured as he began Hope's daily examination, his voice taking on the gentle cadence he'd once used with frightened pets and their anxious owners. The words felt rusty in his throat after years of silence, but Hope responded to the tone, if not the meaning. His small body relaxing under careful hands, the memories came unbidden. As Elias worked, Emma's voice calling from the barn where she'd found another injured animal. Her absolute faith that Daddy could fix anything broken. She'd been 8 when she brought him a baby bird with a damaged wing, tears streaming down her face as she begged him to save it. He'd spent hours crafting a tiny splint, teaching her how to feed the fledgling with an eyedropper, showing her that healing was as much about patience and hope as medical skill. "Will he be able to fly again, Daddy?" she'd asked, watching the bird struggle with its awkward wing. "Maybe not like other birds," he'd answered, "but he'll find his own way to soar." The bird had recovered, learning to navigate with compensated flight patterns, and had returned to their property every spring for 3 years before the fire ended all such homecomings. Now working with Hope's deformed leg, Elias found himself applying the same philosophy, not seeking to restore normal function, but helping the young wolf find his own way to thrive. The gentle massage and range of motion exercises seemed to comfort Hope as much as they helped maintain circulation. The pup would close his eyes during treatment, occasionally releasing small sounds of contentment that reminded Elias painfully of Emma's sleepy murmurs during bedtime stories. When the session ended, Hope would struggle to show his gratitude, attempting to lick Elias's hands despite his exhaustion. By the 3rd day, Hope had shown enough improvement to attempt short walks around the cabin's interior. His method was awkward but effective, using his 3 good legs while dragging the twisted one, moving in a distinctive hopping gait that would become his signature. His determination was remarkable, refusing assistance except when absolutely necessary, driven by some internal fire that wouldn't accept limitation. The alpha watched these indoor exercises through the window, his massive frame silhouetted against the snow-laden pines. His mate had joined him more frequently now, a smaller wolf with silver-tipped fur and eyes that held maternal concern. Together, they observed their offspring's progress with the focused attention of parents monitoring a child's first steps. Elias began leaving the cabin door open during Hope's exercise sessions, allowing the family connection to remain visible and strong. The act required tremendous trust on all sides. Hope could have attempted to flee to his parents. The adults could have tried to reclaim their pup by force, and Elias could have lost the fragile bond he was building with the young wolf. Instead, something beautiful emerged. Hope would venture close to the open door, but always return to Elias's side, choosing the safety and care he'd found in human hands while maintaining visual contact with his pack family. The alpha and his mate would approach within a few yards of the threshold, but never attempted to enter, respecting the boundary between wild and domestic space while remaining close enough to offer parental guidance. The breakthrough came when Hope attempted to bark for the first time since his rescue. The sound was weak and uncertain, more squeak than howl, but it carried across the clearing to where his parents waited. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Both adult wolves lifted their voices in a harmony of encouragement that seemed to shake snow from the surrounding trees. Hope's tail wagged frantically at the sound, his small body vibrating with joy at this reconnection with his pack language. He tried to answer, producing a series of yips and whimpers that gradually strengthened into something resembling a proper wolf vocalization. The conversation that followed was beyond human understanding, but clearly meaningful to all participants. Elias found himself unexpectedly moved by the exchange, remembering how Emma had once practiced singing scales while Sarah accompanied her on the old piano they'd inherited from his mother. The little girl's voice had been sweet but untrained, cracking on the high notes, but Sarah's patient encouragement had eventually helped her find her range. Family, Elias realized, was as much about teaching each other to find their voices as anything else. That evening, as Hope slept exhausted by his various exercises, Elias noticed something that stopped him cold. The pup had arranged his blankets in a specific pattern, dragged them with his teeth until they formed a small den-like structure against the hearth. It was instinctive behavior, the drive to create safe sleeping spaces that ran deep in wolf genetics. But it was also something more. Hope had made himself a home within Elias's home, claiming space without taking over, establishing territory within accepted boundaries. The message was clear to anyone who understood pack dynamics. The young wolf considered himself part of this strange, mixed family unit, accepting human care while maintaining his wild identity. The naming had been inevitable. Though Elias had resisted it for days, Hope seemed too presumptuous, too laden with expectations for an old man who'd given up on the future. But as he watched the pup struggle daily to overcome his limitations, showing courage that put human self-pity to shame, no other name felt appropriate. Hope, he said aloud for the first time, and the pup's ears perked immediately at the sound. That's what you are, isn't it? Hope on 3 legs and a heart too big for this broken world, the wolf pup approached at the sound of his name, dragging his useless leg but radiating determination. When he reached Elias's chair, he struggled to rear up on his hind legs, trying to make contact with the human who'd become his anchor in the storm of disability and abandonment. Elias lifted him carefully, settling the small body in his lap, feeling the rapid heartbeat against his chest. Hope immediately relaxed, pressing his muzzle against Elias's neck in a gesture of absolute trust. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of firelight and the soft sound of sleeping breath, Elias felt something he'd thought destroyed forever. The fierce, protective love of a parent for his child. Outside, the alpha's silhouette remained visible against the snow, a guardian watching over his extended pack. Inside, man and wolf pup found comfort in shared warmth and the promise of tomorrow's challenges. It wasn't the family either had expected, but it was family nonetheless, bound together by need and nurtured by the slow, careful work of learning to trust again. For the first time in 7 years, Elias Gray fell asleep, not to the sound of his own grief, but to the gentle breathing of another living soul who depended on his care. Hope's small heartbeat became a lullaby that carried him into dreams where Emma laughed and Sarah smiled, and somewhere in the distance, wolves sang their ancient songs of survival and love. Sarah's recipe book lay open on the kitchen counter, its pages yellowed and edges softened by years of use. Elias hadn't touched it since the fire, couldn't bear to see her careful handwriting spelling out instructions for Emma's favorite cookies, or the pot roast that had filled their Sunday afternoons with warmth and laughter. But preparing proper nutrition for Hope had led him back to these familiar pages, searching for guidance in feeding schedules and meal planning that Sarah had perfected for their human family. Beef stew with extra broth for growing bodies, he read aloud. Sarah's neat script blurring slightly as his eyes watered. Hope looked up from his morning exercises, tilting his head at the sound of his human's voice. The pup had learned to recognize different tones, the gentle encouragement during physical therapy, the firm commands that kept him safe, and now this new sound tinged with memory and loss. Hope's progress had been remarkable. His twisted leg remained useless, but he developed extraordinary strength in his other 3 limbs, learning to navigate the cabin's interior with increasing confidence. More importantly, his weight was returning, his coat growing thick and lustrous as proper nutrition replaced the starvation that had nearly killed him. The morning routine had become sacred between them. Elias would wake before dawn, stoke the fire, and begin Hope's breakfast, while the pup performed his self-imposed stretching ritual near the hearth. Like all wolves, Hope possessed an internal clock more accurate than any human timepiece, and he'd grown impatient with any deviation from their established schedule. "You're worse than Emma ever was," Elias said, measuring out the meat portions according to guidelines he'd adapted from Sarah's notes on feeding active children. She could smell pancakes from 3 rooms away on Saturday mornings. Hope's ears perked at the mention of pancakes, though he had no context for the word. What he understood was the warmth in Elias's voice when he spoke of these phantom people who seemed to inhabit the cabin's memories. The pup had learned to associate certain tones with comfort and safety, even when the words carried sadness. Outside, the alpha had established a routine as well. Each morning, he would appear at the forest's edge, carrying fresh kills, rabbits, small deer, occasionally fish from the half-frozen creek. The offerings were left at the boundary between wild and domestic space, close enough to show intent, but far enough to respect the invisible lines that governed their unusual arrangement. Initially, Elias had been puzzled by the behavior. Why would the alpha provide food for the human caring for his pup? But understanding had come gradually as he observed the pack's dynamics through the window. This wasn't charity or payment, it was participation. The alpha was contributing to his offspring's care in the only way his nature allowed, providing protein for the strange den where his child was healing. The gesture created an unexpected dilemma. Accepting the gifts felt like crossing a line. Elias wasn't sure he should cross, but refusing them might signal rejection of the partnership the alpha was offering. After days of internal debate, Elias chose acceptance, retrieving each offering with respectful gratitude, preparing the meat according to Sarah's old recipes for hearty stews and roasts. Hope's reaction to these shared meals was illuminating. The meat from his father's hunts carried scents and flavors that triggered deep genetic memories, connecting him to his wild heritage even as he adapted to human care. His eating style would shift subtly during these meals, becoming more wolf-like, more instinctively pack-oriented. But it was the emotional impact that proved most significant. Each meal prepared from the alpha's gifts strengthened the bridge between Hope's 2 families, allowing him to honor both his birth pack and his chosen human while remaining true to his essential nature. He was becoming something new, neither fully wild nor fully domestic, but something uniquely adapted to his specific circumstances. The physical therapy sessions had evolved into something resembling play. Hope had learned to trust Elias completely during the range of motion exercises, relaxing his small body into gentle hands that stretched and massaged his twisted limb. But he'd also begun to initiate games, using his 3 good legs to pounce at Elias's fingers or chase shadows cast by the firelight. These playful moments transported Elias back to evenings when Emma would sprawl on the living room floor, surrounded by coloring books and crayons, chattering about her day at school while he read veterinary journals in his chair. She'd grown bored with her art projects sometimes and resort to tickling his ankles until he abandoned his reading to join her games. "Remember how she used to hide behind the couch and jump out to scare us?" he asked Hope, who cocked his head as if actually listening to the story. Sarah would pretend to be terrified, shriek like she'd seen a ghost, and Emma would collapse in giggles. Same game every night for months, but Sarah acted surprised every single time. Hope responded to the storytelling with focused attention, as if sensing the importance of these memories to his human father. The pup had begun to understand that certain words and tones unlocked parts of Elias's heart that had been locked away, and he seemed determined to encourage these moments of emotional vulnerability. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after Hope's rescue. During what had become their evening routine, Elias was reading aloud from an old veterinary textbook, not because Hope understood the words, but because the sound of his voice seemed to comfort the young wolf. They were settled in the large chair by the fire, Hope curled in Elias's lap. When the pup did something extraordinary, he began to vocalize softly, not the sharp yips of excitement or the whimpers of discomfort, but a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to match the cadence of Elias's reading. It was Hope's attempt to participate in the human ritual of shared evening time, to contribute his voice to the peaceful sounds that marked the end of each day. The sound was so reminiscent of Emma humming along to Sarah's lullabies that Elias stopped reading abruptly, overwhelmed by the parallel. Hope sensed the change immediately, lifting his head to study his human's face with concerned golden eyes. When he saw tears, the pup did what came naturally. He pressed closer, offering wordless comfort in the form of warmth and presence. "You understand, don't you?" Elias whispered, stroking the soft fur behind Hope's ears. "You know what it's like to lose your family, to have everything you knew torn away. But you also know what it's like to find something unexpected in the middle of all that pain." Outside, the Alpha's evening howl rose into the star-filled sky, calling his pack together for their nightly hunt. Hope lifted his head at the sound, adding his small voice to the wild chorus that echoed through the mountains. But when the howling ended, he settled back against Elias's chest, choosing the warmth of human companionship over the call of the wild. It was a choice that spoke to the complexity of their relationship. Hope honoring his wolf heritage while embracing his human family, maintaining connections to both worlds without fully belonging to either. He was creating something new, a bridge between species that honored the needs and nature of both. As the fire burned low and sleep beckoned, Elias realized that Hope's presence had given him something he'd thought lost forever, the ability to nurture and protect, to feel responsible for another's well-being, to plan for a future that extended beyond merely surviving until tomorrow. The pup had awakened the father in him, the healer, the man who'd once believed that love was stronger than loss. Sarah's recipe book remained open on the counter, her handwriting a gentle reminder that love leaves recipes for those who come after, instructions for nourishing the hearts and bodies of families yet to be formed. Tomorrow, Elias would try her recipe for venison stew with extra vegetables, adapted for a wolf pup who was teaching an old man how to hope again. Spring arrived in the Colorado Rockies like a promise kept after a long and bitter winter. The snow began its retreat from the lower elevations, revealing patches of brown earth that would soon burst with wildflowers and new grass. Ice melted from the creek with musical sounds that had been silent for months, and the air carried sense of awakening life that stirred something primal in both man and wolf. Hope had grown considerably during the winter months, his small pup frame filling out into the lean, powerful build of an adolescent wolf. His twisted leg remained as useless as ever, but his adaptation to three-legged locomotion had become so natural that watching him move no longer inspired pity, but admiration. He'd developed a distinctive bounding gait that carried him over rough terrain with surprising speed and grace. Elias's father's hunting rifle hung above the mantel, a lever-action Winchester that had belonged to 3 generations of Gray men. It hadn't been fired in 7 years, not since Elias had abandoned hunting, along with everything else that connected him to his former life. But Hope's presence had reawakened protective instincts that ran deeper than grief, and he'd begun cleaning and maintaining the weapon, with the careful attention his father had taught him decades ago. "A man protects what he loves," his father had said, during those long-ago hunting trips into these same mountains. "But he only kills what he can't protect any other way. The rifle is a tool, son, not a solution. Sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when not to use it." Those words carried new weight as Elias watched Hope's interaction with the pack through the cabin window. The Alpha and his mate visited daily now, bringing not only fresh kills, but also other pack members who seemed curious about the unusual arrangement. Hope would greet them through the glass, his tail wagging frantically, his vocalizations growing more sophisticated as he learned to communicate across the barrier between wild and domestic space. But it was the pack's behavior toward Elias that proved most remarkable. They no longer treated him as a threat to be monitored, but as something approaching an accepted member of their extended family. When he ventured outside with Hope for exercise sessions, the adult wolves would position themselves at respectful distances, Watching protectively rather than suspiciously, the alpha's mate had begun bringing gifts of her own, not meat, but other tokens of acceptance. A particularly beautiful piece of driftwood polished smooth by mountain streams, a collection of interesting stones, once incredibly a cluster of early wildflowers that she'd somehow carried without crushing them completely. These offerings seemed to recognize Elias as more than just Hope's caretaker. They acknowledged him as worthy of courtesy and respect. Hope's hunting instincts had begun to emerge despite his disability. He'd started stalking insects around the cabin, practicing pouncing techniques that compensated for his uneven mobility. His success rate was surprisingly high, suggesting that what he lacked in traditional wolf anatomy, he made up for in intelligence and determination. One morning, Elias watched through the window as Hope demonstrated his developing skills to his pack family. A ground squirrel had emerged from its burrow near the cabin, and Hope immediately dropped into hunting position. His approach was necessarily different from a typical wolf's. He couldn't rely on four-legged stalking or the explosive sprint that marked normal predatory behavior. Instead, Hope used patience and positioning, moving slowly to place himself downwind of his target, using terrain features to mask his approach. When he finally struck, his technique was uniquely his own. A sideways lunge that brought his three functional legs to bear simultaneously, creating enough force and speed to catch the surprised squirrel. The kill was swift and clean, executed with the precise neck bite that marked Hope as truly his father's son. The alpha watched from the tree line, his massive head held high with unmistakable pride. His offspring might be physically different, but he was proving himself a capable predator who could contribute to pack survival. Hope carried his prize to the cabin's front porch, presenting it to Elias with the ceremonial gravity of a young warrior bringing his first kill to the tribal elders. The gesture was deeply meaningful in wolf culture. Sharing food with pack members was a fundamental expression of belonging and mutual support. Elias accepted the gift with appropriate solemnity, understanding that this moment marked Hope's transition from dependent pup to contributing pack member. The squirrel would become part of their evening stew, prepared according to Sarah's notes on small game cookery, honoring both the kill and the hunter who'd provided it. But Hope's success had broader implications that became apparent over the following days. The pack's visits increased in frequency and duration, with more members participating in what appeared to be educational sessions. Hope would demonstrate his adapted hunting techniques, while his elders offered vocal encouragement and correction. It was clear that the young wolf was being integrated into pack knowledge and culture, despite his unusual living arrangements. The alpha began including Elias in these teaching moments, approaching closer to the cabin when demonstrations were taking place, positioning himself where the human could observe pack dynamics and social structures. It seemed the great wolf understood that Hope's unusual circumstances required his human father to learn wolf ways, just as Hope was learning human ones. These extended interactions revealed the sophisticated nature of wolf pack relationships. Each member had specific roles and responsibilities that went far beyond simple dominance hierarchies. The alpha's mate served as the pack's primary educator, teaching hunting strategies and social protocols. Other adults contributed specialized knowledge, tracking skills, territory management, weather prediction based on natural signs. Hope absorbed these lessons with remarkable speed, his intelligence allowing him to adapt pack wisdom to his specific physical limitations. He learned to read wind patterns, not just for hunting, but for detecting threats at greater distances than his mobility would allow him to escape. He mastered communication techniques that let him coordinate with pack mates despite being unable to keep pace with their movements. But perhaps most importantly, Hope learned to balance his dual loyalties to his birth pack and to Elias. He would participate in pack activities when possible, contributing his voice to group hunts even when he couldn't physically join them. But he always returned to the cabin, choosing human companionship for rest and recovery. Accepting care that his wild family couldn't provide, the arrangement shouldn't have worked according to any natural law Elias understood, yet it functioned with surprising harmony. Hope bridged two worlds that had no business connecting, creating understanding between species that had been predator and prey, competitor and enemy for thousands of years. One evening, as Hope slept exhausted by a particularly intensive pack training session, Elias sat cleaning his father's rifle and considering the implications of their situation. The weapon had been a symbol of man's dominance over nature, humanity's ability to impose will through superior firepower. But Hope's presence had taught him something different, that strength sometimes came from vulnerability, that survival might depend on cooperation rather than conquest. The rifle would remain ready, cleaned and loaded, because protection was still necessary. But it would be used, if at all, to defend family rather than assert dominance, to preserve the fragile peace that had grown between human and wolf, rather than maintain the ancient divisions that kept them apart. Outside, the alpha's evening howl rose into the star-filled sky, calling his pack together for their nightly hunt. Hope stirred at the sound, but didn't wake, secure in the knowledge that his two families, wild and human, were watching over him as he dreamed. In the firelight, his twisted leg twitched slightly, chasing dream prey across landscapes where disability was no barrier to belonging, where love created families that defied every natural law except the most important one of all. The walking stick had started as a practical necessity. Hope's growing size and weight made his three-legged gait more challenging, particularly on the steep, rocky terrain surrounding the cabin. Elias spent evenings whittling mountain ash into a support system that could help stabilize the young wolf during his increasingly ambitious explorations of their territory. The design had evolved through trial and error, shaped by observation of Hope's unique movement patterns and the specific challenges his twisted leg presented. What emerged was less a traditional walking stick and more a carefully crafted mobility aid, curved to match Hope's natural posture, padded where it contacted his body, weighted for balance. The mountain ash was strong, yet flexible, able to bend with Hope's movements without breaking under stress. But the walking stick became something more significant than Elias had intended. Hope took to it immediately, seeming to understand that this tool extended his capabilities rather than highlighting his limitations. With its support, he could navigate terrain that had previously been impossible, could keep pace with pack activities that had left him watching from the sidelines. The first successful hunt using the walking stick marked a turning point for the entire pack. Hope had positioned himself along a game trail, using the stick to maintain perfect stillness while waiting for prey. When a young rabbit appeared, Hope's strike was devastating in its efficiency, the walking stick providing the stability he needed to deliver maximum force with his three functional legs. The kill was witnessed by the entire pack, who had positioned themselves to observe this test of their unusual family members' capabilities. The alpha's howl of approval echoed across the mountain valley, calling other packs for miles around to witness his offspring's success. Hope had proven himself not just capable despite his disability, but capable in ways that were uniquely his own. From that day forward, the pack's dynamics shifted subtly but significantly. Hope was no longer the protected youngling requiring special accommodation. He was a contributing hunter whose adapted techniques offered lessons for the entire group. His patience and positioning skills, developed out of necessity, proved superior to those of fully mobile pack members in certain hunting situations. The walking stick also enabled Hope to participate in pack patrols of their territory. These were essential activities for wolf families, marking boundaries, assessing threats, maintaining the complex scent maps that defined their domain. Hope's inclusion in these expeditions marked his full acceptance as an adult pack member with responsibilities beyond mere survival. Elias often accompanied these patrols, invited by the Alpha to observe and learn the intricate protocols that governed pack behavior. These journeys revealed the sophisticated nature of wolf territorial management. Every tree, rock, and stream held significance in a complex system of communication and navigation that had evolved over millennia. But it was Hope's role as translator between species that proved most valuable during these expeditions. He could communicate pack intentions to Elias through body language and vocalizations, while interpreting human concerns and observations for his wolf family. The young wolf had become a bridge between worlds, facilitating understanding that benefited everyone involved. The walking stick bore the marks of these adventures: scratches from rocky terrain, smooth, worn patches where Hope's weight had polished the wood, small notches that told stories of successful hunts and challenging journeys. It was becoming a record of Hope's growth from helpless pup to capable adult, a testament to the power of adaptation and determination. One particular patrol revealed something that changed everything about their peaceful arrangement. The pack had been investigating strange scents near the southern boundary of their territory when Hope suddenly froze, his hackles rising in a way Elias had never seen before. The walking stick trembled under the young wolf's weight as every muscle tensed with alarm. The alpha and his mate immediately responded to Hope's warning, their own body language shifting into high alert. Through careful observation, Elias learned to read the subtle communications passing between pack members. This wasn't the excitement of detecting prey or the wariness of encountering another pack. This was fear. The scent that had triggered their alarm was unfamiliar to Elias, but clearly recognized by the wolves. It carried undertones of metal and chemical preservatives, human-made substances that had no place in the natural environment. Following the scent trail led to a discovery that made Elias's blood run cold: carefully concealed snares positioned along game trails. Designed to catch and hold large predators, the snares were sophisticated, crafted by someone with extensive knowledge of wolf behavior and movement patterns. They were positioned at natural choke points, where running wolves would be unable to change direction, placed at heights that would catch adults, while allowing smaller prey to pass safely beneath. But most disturbing were the bait stations, meat laced with substances that Elias's veterinary training helped him identify as slow-acting poisons. The bait was positioned to appeal specifically to wolves, using scents and flavors that would be irresistible to hungry predators while being ignored by other wildlife. The implications were staggering. Someone was systematically hunting the pack, using methods that suggested both extensive preparation and intimate knowledge of their territory and habits. This wasn't random poaching or opportunistic hunting. This was a targeted campaign to eliminate specific animals. Hope's discovery of the threats demonstrated the value his unique perspective brought to pack survival. His human upbringing had made him sensitive to artificial scents and unnatural patterns that his wild-born family members might have missed until it was too late. His disability, which had seemed like a weakness, had given him observational skills that proved essential for group protection. The pack's response to the discovery was swift and coordinated. Territory that had been safe for generations was suddenly filled with hidden dangers that required constant vigilance and adaptive strategies. Traditional hunting grounds had to be abandoned, familiar trails avoided, the entire social structure of pack life disrupted by human interference. But rather than excluding Hope from the dangerous new reality, the pack drew him closer. His ability to detect artificial threats, combined with his communication skills with their human ally, made him an essential part of their survival strategy. The walking stick, originally created to help him keep up, now enabled him to serve as an early warning system for dangers his family couldn't recognize. Elias found himself drawn deeper into pack life by necessity rather than choice. The threats endangering Hope's family were also threats to the unusual peace they'd all built together. His human knowledge of trapping techniques and poison detection could mean the difference between survival and extinction for creatures he'd come to love as his own family. The evening routine in the cabin changed as these new realities settled in. Hope would position himself by the window, using his elevated view to monitor approaches to their sanctuary, while Elias cleaned weapons and planned defensive strategies. The walking stick stood propped beside Hope's watching post, ready for rapid deployment if threats materialized. But in quiet moments, when immediate dangers seemed distant, the walking stick resumed its original purpose, helping Hope navigate the challenges of daily life with grace and determination. Watching him use the tool with such natural skill, Elias was reminded that adaptation wasn't about overcoming limitations, but about finding new ways to express essential nature. The mountain ash had been carved with love and shaped by need, but it had become something greater than the sum of its parts. Like Hope himself, like their impossible family, like the fragile peace between human and wolf. The walking stick proved that the most beautiful solutions often emerged from the most difficult challenges. As snow began to fall again, covering their tracks and muffling the sounds of their movements, Elias realized that they were all learning to walk differently now, more carefully, more purposefully, but also more together than any of them had been before the threats emerged from the shadows of their mountain sanctuary. The poacher's snare gleamed dully in the morning light, its steel cable as cold and merciless as the man who'd set it. Elias knelt beside the device, his veterinary training automatically cataloging the sophisticated construction, aircraft-grade cable, self-locking mechanism, positioned at the precise height to catch a running wolf around the neck or torso. This wasn't the work of an amateur looking to make quick money from pelts. This was professional, methodical, and deeply personal. Hope stood beside him, balanced on his walking stick, his golden eyes fixed on the trap with an intelligence that spoke to hard-won wisdom about human cruelty. The young wolf had led them to this discovery, his enhanced sensitivity to artificial sense detecting what his wild-born family had missed. But there was something in his posture that suggested more than just alertness. There was recognition, as if he'd encountered this particular threat before. "You know this smell, don't you?" Elias murmured, studying Hope's reaction. The wolf's hackles remained raised, his breathing shallow and rapid. "This isn't the first time you've come across these traps." The realization hit him like a physical blow. Hope's twisted leg, the deformity that had marked him as weak in his pack's harsh mathematics of survival. What if it hadn't been a birth defect at all? What if it had been the result of an earlier encounter with these same snares? An injury so severe it had convinced his family to abandon him rather than watch him suffer. Elias examined the trap more carefully, noting the wear patterns on the cable, the weathering of the metal components. The snare had been in place for months, possibly since the previous hunting season. Long enough to have claimed victims already. Long enough to have taught the local wildlife that familiar paths were no longer safe. The evidence trail led deeper into the forest, revealing a network of traps and bait stations that covered miles of pack territory. Someone had invested significant time and resources in this operation, studying wolf behavior patterns, mapping their movements, identifying their vulnerabilities with scientific precision. The scope was staggering. Dozens of snares, poison stations, even hidden cameras positioned to document successful kills. But it was the final discovery that transformed Elias's growing concern into cold fury. Tucked beneath a camouflaged blind, they found a collection of photographs, wolves caught in snares, their struggles documented in horrifying detail. Pack members Elias recognized, animals he'd watched playing with Hope, teaching him, accepting him into their family structure. Among the photographs was one that made his hands shake with rage. A much smaller Hope, barely 3 months old, his hind leg caught in a snare very similar to the one they'd just discovered. The pup's eyes held the same intelligence and determination they showed now, but they also held terror and pain that no young creature should ever experience. The photograph was dated from the previous winter, taken weeks before Elias had found Hope dying in the snow near his cabin. The story it told was heartbreaking in its clarity. Hope hadn't been abandoned by his pack because of a birth defect. He'd been left to die because human cruelty had crippled him so severely that his family believed mercy lay in allowing nature to claim him rather than watching him suffer. But Hope had survived that abandonment, crawling through snow and bitter cold until he reached the only human dwelling in miles. Whether by instinct, desperation, or something approaching faith, he'd sought help from the very species that had destroyed his mobility and scattered his family. The courage that choice represented was staggering. The alpha's behavior suddenly made perfect sense. His initial wariness hadn't been about protecting his offspring from human danger. It had been about trusting the same species that had already nearly killed his child once. His gradual acceptance of Elias represented a leap of faith that went against every survival instinct evolved over millennia. More photographs revealed the systematic destruction of the pack's extended family. Elders who had taught Hope to hunt, young adults who had served as playmates and protectors, mothers with pups who would never see another spring. The poacher had been documenting his kills like trophies, creating a record of ecological devastation that would take generations to repair. But the most chilling discovery came last. Recent photographs showing Hope with his walking stick, images of Elias during their daily exercises, detailed surveillance of their cabin and the pack's visits. Someone had been watching them for weeks, studying their routines, planning something that required intimate knowledge of their relationships and vulnerabilities. A handwritten journal found with the photographs revealed the poacher's motivations and methods. Marcus Webb, according to the identification documents Elias discovered, was a former wildlife management officer who'd been dismissed for illegal practices 3 years earlier. His notes revealed an obsession with what he called genetic purity in wolf populations, a twisted philosophy that viewed Hope's survival as contamination of natural selection processes. Webb's writings became increasingly unhinged as they detailed his campaign against the pack. He blamed Hope's acceptance by both wild wolves and humans for encouraging unnatural behavior that threatened traditional predator-prey relationships. In his distorted worldview, Elias's care for the disabled pup represented human interference that needed to be corrected through violence. The journal's final entries made Webb's intentions clear. He planned to use Hope as bait to eliminate the entire pack, then kill both the young wolf and his human protector, as a warning to others who might interfere with what he saw as natural law. The attack was scheduled for the following week, timed to coincide with the full moon when wolf activity would be at its peak. Hope seemed to understand the gravity of their discovery. His usual playfulness had vanished, replaced by the alert watchfulness of a veteran warrior preparing for battle. He positioned himself between Elias and the forest, his walking stick planted firmly in the ground, ready to defend his human father against threats both of them now understood were very real. The pack's recent behavior patterns suddenly made perfect sense. Their increased vigilance, the way they'd begun positioning themselves as guards around the cabin, their reluctance to venture far from Hope's sanctuary. They'd been aware of the danger all along, reading signs that Elias's human senses had missed, but awareness of the threat brought its own terrible burden. Webb's surveillance photographs proved he knew their routines, their vulnerabilities, the depth of their relationships. He'd turned their love for each other into a weapon that could be used against them, their care for Hope into the very tool that would enable their destruction. As Elias gathered the evidence of Webb's planned massacre, he felt something he hadn't experienced since the night his own family died. The crushing weight of responsibility for lives that depended on his choices. The fire that had claimed Sarah and Emma had been an accident, a tragedy beyond anyone's control. But this threat was different. This time he had advance warning. This time he might be able to protect the family he'd found in the wilderness. The walking stick that had enabled Hope's mobility now seemed fragile in the face of human hatred and obsession. But as Elias watched the young wolf scan the forest for signs of danger, he realized that adaptation had prepared them for this moment. Hope's disability had taught them all to survive through intelligence rather than strength, cooperation rather than dominance. The poacher's snares represented everything ugly about humanity's relationship with the natural world. The need to control, to eliminate, to impose order through violence. But Hope's survival, his integration into both human and wolf families, proved that different relationships were possible. Love could bridge any gap, heal any wound, overcome any obstacle except perhaps the hatred of those who couldn't understand it. As they made their way back to the cabin, Hope moving confidently with his walking stick, Elias began planning their defense against an enemy who had turned their greatest strength, their love for each other, into their greatest vulnerability. The next full moon was 8 days away. 8 days to prepare for a confrontation that would determine whether their impossible family would survive, or whether human hatred would succeed in destroying something beautiful and rare that had grown in the space between worlds. Emma's Scout badge collection lay spread across Elias's kitchen table like a map of childhood adventures and hard-won achievements. Camping, tracking, wilderness survival, first aid. Each colorful patch represented skills she'd mastered under his patient guidance during weekend expeditions into these same mountains. He'd saved them after the fire, unable to part with these tangible reminders of his daughter's curiosity and courage, and now their lessons might save the lives of his new family. Remember how she wanted to learn everything, Hope. Elias murmured as he studied the badges, his tactical planning overlaid with bittersweet memories. Every knot, every plant identification, every weather sign. She said she wanted to be ready for anything the mountains could throw at her. Hope lay beside the table, his walking stick within easy reach, golden eyes tracking Elias's movements as he translated childhood scouting lessons into adult warfare strategies. The young wolf seemed to understand that preparation was taking place, that the quiet days of healing and growth were ending in favor of something far more dangerous. The badges told a story of progressive skill building that paralleled what Elias now needed to accomplish in 8 days. Basic camping had taught Emma about shelter and concealment, knowledge that would help them create safe zones and escape routes throughout their territory. Tracking skills would enable them to monitor Webb's movements and predict his approach routes. First aid training might mean the difference between life and death if the confrontation went badly, but it was the wilderness survival badge that held the most relevant lessons. Emma had earned it by demonstrating her ability to live off the land for 3 days, using only basic tools and her accumulated knowledge. The exercise had taught her that survival wasn't about overpowering nature, but about understanding it well enough to work within its rules. Webb's surveillance photos had revealed his ignorance of those same rules. His hide locations were positioned for visibility rather than scent concealment. His trap placements followed human logic rather than wolf behavior patterns. His timing was based on lunar cycles rather than the complex social and environmental factors that actually governed pack activities. He was a dangerous enemy, but he was also an outsider trying to impose control on a system he didn't truly understand. Elias began creating a defense plan that leveraged every advantage their unusual family possessed. Hope's mobility limitations had taught him patience and observation skills that far exceeded those of his fully abled packmates. The alpha's experience and intelligence, combined with his mate's maternal protectiveness, created leadership that could coordinate complex group activities. The pack's intimate knowledge of their territory, accumulated over generations, gave them options that no human intruder could anticipate. The cabin itself became the first element of their defensive strategy. Its position offered commanding views of the most likely approach routes, while its solid construction could provide temporary shelter if fighting became necessary. Elias reinforced the doors and windows, created firing positions that would allow him to use his father's rifle effectively, and established supply caches that could sustain them during a prolonged siege. But the real strength of their position lay in the pack's ability to function as an integrated unit, across miles of difficult terrain. Using hope as a communication link, Elias began coordinating with the Alpha to establish a network of observation posts, escape routes, and ambush positions that turned their entire territory into a defensive maze. The plan required each pack member to use their specific strengths in coordinated fashion. The Alpha and his mate would serve as primary fighters, their size and experience making them formidable opponents in direct confrontation. Younger pack members would function as scouts and messengers, their speed and agility allowing them to gather intelligence and coordinate movements across the mountainous landscape. Hope's role was perhaps the most crucial. His human upbringing enabled him to understand tactics and timing in ways that purely wild wolves couldn't grasp, while his pack integration allowed him to communicate complex strategies to family members who operated on instinct rather than analysis. He would serve as field commander, translating human military thinking into wolf pack coordination. The walking stick became part of Hope's tactical equipment, modified with Elias's help to serve multiple functions. Its tip was sharpened to provide a backup weapon if needed, its length adjusted to improve Hope's stability during rapid movements, its surface treated with scents that would allow pack members to track his location, even in poor visibility conditions. Training sessions began immediately, with Hope serving as instructor for tactical concepts his wolf family had never encountered. Basic military principles, flanking maneuvers, coordinated attacks, strategic withdrawal, were adapted to pack hunting behaviors and refined through repetitive practice. The Alpha proved remarkably quick to grasp concepts like pincer movements and diversionary tactics. His natural leadership instincts translating military strategy into pack coordination, but the most challenging aspect of preparation was psychological rather than tactical. The pack had to overcome instincts that counseled flight rather than fight when faced with superior human technology. Webb's rifles, traps, and poisons represented threats that normal wolf responses couldn't address effectively. Victory would require them to act against evolutionary programming, to stand and fight when every survival instinct urged retreat. Elias found himself drawing on memories of Emma's determination during difficult scout challenges. She'd faced situations that seemed impossible for someone her age, climbing rock faces that intimidated adult hikers, navigating by compass through trackless wilderness, building shelters in conditions that would have defeated experienced campers. But she'd approached each challenge with absolute confidence that preparation and persistence would overcome any obstacle. Fear is just another weather condition. "Daddy," she told him during a particularly difficult winter camping trip, "you prepare for it, you work with it, but you don't let it stop you from doing what needs to be done." That philosophy would serve them well in the coming confrontation. Webb's weapons and experience made him dangerous, but his obsessions also made him predictable. His hatred of their family would drive him to take risks that tactical wisdom would counsel against. His need to document his kills would create opportunities for counterattack. His isolation from normal human society would mean no backup, no support, no one to notice if he failed to return from his planned massacre. The pack's nightly meetings took on new intensity as the full moon approached. What had once been social gatherings became military briefings, with Hope translating between human tactical concepts and wolf pack dynamics. Each member received specific assignments, backup positions, contingency plans that addressed various scenarios Webb might employ. But beneath the tactical planning lay something more fundamental, a shared commitment to protect what they'd built together. This wasn't just about surviving an attack. It was about defending a family that transcended species boundaries, a love that had grown from mutual need into something strong enough to justify any risk. The Alpha's acceptance of human military concepts demonstrated trust that went beyond mere cooperation. He was allowing Elias to plan strategies that could get pack members killed, betting their lives on the judgment of a species that had historically been their greatest enemy. That level of faith represented evolutionary progress, measured not in millennia, but in months of shared experience. Hope's integration of both worlds reached its culmination during these preparation sessions. He moved seamlessly between human tactical thinking and wolfpack instincts, translating concepts across species lines with a fluency that made communication look effortless. His disability had forced him to develop mental strengths that now served the entire family's survival needs. As the final night before Webb's planned attack arrived, Elias sat with Hope beside the fire, Emma's scout badges arranged on the table like military decorations. Each patch represented a skill that might prove crucial in the coming fight, a lesson learned through patient practice that could mean the difference between survival and destruction. "She would have loved you," Elias told Hope, stroking the young wolf's fur while checking his equipment one final time. Emma always believed that families were made by choice rather than blood, that love was stronger than any difference that tried to keep people apart. Hope pressed closer to his human father, offering wordless comfort in the form of warmth and presence. Outside, the pack took their positions for the night's vigil, disappearing into shadows and terrain features that would make them invisible to human eyes. The full moon was rising, casting silver light across the battlefield where love would face hatred, where adaptation would confront destruction, where an impossible family would discover whether the bonds they'd built were strong enough to survive the ultimate test. The walking stick stood ready beside Hope's sleeping place, a simple piece of carved wood that had become a symbol of their entire journey together. Tomorrow, it would either help carry them to victory or serve as a memorial to a family that had dared to love across the vast divide between human and wild hearts. Sarah's silver compass trembled in Elias's palm as he checked their position one final time before moving into what might become a killing ground. The needle pointed steadily north toward the ridge where Webb had established his main observation post, but more importantly, it reminded Elias that he'd finally found his true direction after 7 years of wandering through grief and isolation. He was no longer running from life, he was fighting to protect it. Hope crouched beside him in the pre-dawn darkness, his walking stick planted firmly in the rocky soil, golden eyes scanning the terrain ahead with the focused intensity of a veteran warrior. The young wolf's breathing was controlled and steady, showing none of the fear that should have overwhelmed someone facing their first real battle. His disability had prepared him for this moment in ways that normal development never could have. He'd learned to think tactically, to plan rather than simply react, to find strength in adaptation rather than brute force. The pack had taken their assigned positions throughout the valley, invisible to human eyes, but connected by communication networks that had evolved over millennia. The Alpha commanded the high ground to the east, his massive frame concealed among the boulder fields that would allow him to strike from above. His mate controlled the western approaches, her smaller size and greater agility perfect for hit-and-run tactics. Younger pack members served as mobile reserves, ready to reinforce any position that came under heavy pressure. Webb's approach had been detected an hour before sunrise by scouts positioned along the most likely infiltration routes. He was moving with the confidence of someone who believed his surveillance had revealed all relevant tactical information, following patterns that made sense from his limited perspective, but ignored the complex social structures that actually governed pack behavior. The first engagement came sooner than expected. Webb had positioned himself to observe the cabin through a high-powered scope, waiting for Hope's morning exercise routine to begin before springing whatever trap he'd prepared. But his hide location, chosen for visibility rather than concealment, had been obvious to wolves, whose survival depended on detecting threats at maximum range. 2 young pack members flanked Webb's position while he focused on the cabin below, their approach masked by terrain features and wind patterns he hadn't considered in his planning. The attack was swift and coordinated, one wolf creating a distraction while the other struck at his weapon, sending the rifle spinning away into the rocks below. But Webb proved more dangerous than anticipated. His backup weapons included tranquilizer equipment and snares designed for rapid deployment, tools that turned the confined space of his hide into a trap for his attackers. One young wolf escaped cleanly, but the other became entangled in cable that tightened with every movement, creating a situation that required immediate rescue. Hope's response demonstrated the tactical thinking that made him invaluable despite his physical limitations. Rather than charging directly toward the trapped pack member, he analyzed the tactical situation and identified Webb's weakness. The poacher's obsession with documenting his kills had made him dependent on equipment that required stable positioning and clear sightlines. Using his walking stick for stability, Hope began a careful approach that took advantage of dead ground and natural concealment. His three-legged gait, normally a disadvantage in direct confrontation, proved perfect for the patient stalking required to close distance without detection. Webb's attention remained focused on his trapped victim and the approaching rescue attempts, allowing Hope to position himself for a strike that would neutralize the immediate threat. The attack came from an angle Webb hadn't anticipated. Launched by a wolf he'd assumed was too disabled to participate in serious combat. Hope's unique fighting style, developed through months of adaptation, proved devastatingly effective in close quarters. His walking stick became a weapon that extended his reach and provided leverage for attacks that a normal wolf couldn't have delivered. Webb's tranquilizer gun discharged wildly as he tried to bring it to bear on his unexpected attacker. The dart intended for Hope instead striking a tree trunk, where it quivered like an accusation. The poacher's panic revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of what he faced. This wasn't a crippled animal to be pitied or easily dispatched, but a thinking opponent whose apparent weakness concealed tactical advantages. Hope's assault forced Webb to abandon his position, leaving behind equipment and taking ground that offered less favorable fields of fire. The trapped pack member was freed by his rescuers, injured but mobile, able to rejoin the fight that was spreading across multiple positions throughout the valley. But Webb's retreat was tactical rather than panicked, falling back to secondary positions he'd prepared during his surveillance operation. His military background showed in the way he used terrain and equipment to force the pack into situations where their numbers became less advantageous. Choke points where only single wolves could advance. Open areas where his remaining weapons could engage multiple targets. Positions that required the pack to expose themselves to coordinated fire. The compass in Elias's hand spun wildly as he moved to support Hope's advance, its needle unable to find magnetic north through the metal-rich rocks of the ridge. But Elias no longer needed external guidance to find his direction. Hope's courage had shown him that true north lay in the willingness to fight for those you loved, regardless of the odds or the cost. Webb's voice echoed across the battlefield as he attempted to use psychological warfare against opponents he still didn't understand. His threats and taunts were directed at Elias, trying to break the human's resolve by highlighting the impossibility of their situation, the futility of trying to protect wild animals from their natural fate. "They're not your family, Gray." Webb's amplified voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "They're predators who'll abandon you the moment it serves their interests. You're fighting for animals that would eat your corpse if you died up here." But Hope's response made Webb's ignorance clear to everyone involved. The young wolf positioned himself protectively between the poacher's voice and Elias, his walking stick planted like a battle standard, his body language declaring absolute loyalty despite the danger. The pack closed ranks around their human member, creating a defensive formation that spoke louder than any words about the bonds they'd forged across species lines. The compass steadied as Elias found solid ground, its needle pointing toward the final confrontation that would determine whether their impossible family survived or died together on this wind-swept ridge. Webb had chosen the battlefield, but he'd underestimated the enemy he faced, not just wolves or a grieving man, but something entirely new, a family forged in love rather than genetics. united by choice rather than instinct. Hope's golden eyes met Elias's across the tactical space between them, and in that moment, two very different beings shared perfect understanding. They'd both lost their original families to forces beyond their control, but they'd found something stronger in each other, a connection that transcended species, a love that made any sacrifice worthwhile. The final phase was beginning, and whatever happened next, they would face it together. The moment came when the alpha wolf, leader of his pack for 7 years, father to Hope, guardian of territory that stretched across 3 mountain valleys, did something that went against every instinct evolution had bred into his bones. He lowered his massive head and allowed Elias Gray to place a trembling human hand upon his scarred muzzle, the ultimate gesture of trust between species that had been enemies since the dawn of time. Webb's final trap had been sprung with devastating precision. Cornered in his last defensive position, the poacher had activated a device that filled the air with chemical scents designed to trigger panic in wolf nervous systems. The pack scattered instinctively, their coordinated tactics dissolving into individual survival responses as artificial pheromones overrode millions of years of social programming. But Hope refused to flee. His walking stick planted firmly in the rocky ground, he stood between Webb's weapon and Elias, his golden eyes blazing with determination that his twisted leg couldn't diminish. The young wolf's voice rose in a howl that carried no fear, only defiance, a call that reached his scattered family and demanded they remember what they were fighting for. Webb's rifle swung toward Hope with deadly intent, the poacher's finger tightening on the trigger as he prepared to end what he saw as an abomination against natural order. His voice carried triumph and hatred in equal measure as he prepared to destroy the bridge between worlds that Hope represented. "Time to put you out of your misery, you crippled freak. Should have died in the snow where I left you the first time." But the alpha's response shattered Webb's expectations like glass. Fighting through chemical terror that should have reduced him to pure panic, the great wolf forced himself to think rather than simply react. Hope's courage called to something deeper than instinct, deeper than fear, deeper than the ancient programming that governed pack behavior. The alpha's charge came from an impossible angle. Launched from terrain Webb had considered impassable for large predators. His massive frame struck the poacher like an avalanche, sending the rifle spinning away into the rocks, while 200 pounds of muscle and determination drove Webb to the ground with bone-jarring force. But even as the alpha's jaws closed around Webb's shoulder, the poacher triggered his final contingency, a dead man's switch connected to explosive charges placed around Hope's favorite resting spots. The plan was to destroy the young wolf and his human protector simultaneously, eliminating the evidence of interspecies cooperation that Webb's twisted philosophy couldn't tolerate. Hope heard the electronic beeping that preceded detonation, his enhanced senses detecting frequencies that human ears missed. Without hesitation, he abandoned the safety of his position and launched himself toward Elias, his walking stick providing the stability he needed to cover ground with desperate speed. The collision knocked, both of them behind a boulder outcropping, seconds before the explosives turned their former position into smoking rubble. Hope's body shielded Elias from the worst of the blast, his lightweight frame absorbing impacts that would have been fatal to his human father. When the echoes faded, the young wolf lay motionless. His walking stick snapped in half, his breathing shallow and labored. Rage filled Elias with a purity he'd never experienced before. Not the helpless anger that had consumed him after the fire, but focused fury that demanded action and justice. Webb had tried to destroy his family not once, but twice, had turned Hope's courage and love into weapons against him. The poacher represented everything ugly about humanity's relationship with the natural world. The need to control through violence, to eliminate what couldn't be understood, to impose order through death. The alpha's trust token came as Webb tried to escape through terrain that favored human mobility over wolf pursuit. With the pack still scattered by chemical warfare and Hope unconscious from his injuries, Elias found himself alone with the great wolf who'd become his unlikely partner in protecting their shared child. Language barriers dissolved in that moment of crisis. The alpha's intelligent yellow eyes met Elias's, and communication passed between them that needed no words. They were fathers, protectors, beings who would sacrifice everything for the young life they both cherished. Species meant nothing in the face of that shared commitment. Together, human and wolf began their pursuit of the man who'd threatened their family. The alpha's tracking abilities guided them along Webb's escape route, while Elias's tactical thinking anticipated where the poacher would go to ground. Their coordination was perfect, each compensating for the other's limitations, creating a hunting partnership that transcended evolutionary boundaries. Webb's capture came at the edge of a cliff where the valley floor dropped away into empty air. Cornered between predators who'd learned to work together, he made the mistake of underestimating what love could accomplish when it operated across species lines. "You can't protect them forever, Gray," Webb snarled, his back to the precipice. "There are others who think like me, others who understand what you're doing to the natural order. This isn't over." But as Elias looked into the alpha's eyes and saw his own determination reflected there, he knew Webb was wrong. What they'd built together, human and wolf, damaged beings who'd found healing in each other's company, was stronger than hatred, more enduring than violence, more natural than any philosophy that denied the possibility of love across species boundaries. The alpha's final gesture came as Webb made his desperate bid for escape, trying to leap across a gap that might have been navigable for a younger, more desperate man. The great wolf's massive head pressed briefly against Elias's shoulder, a moment of contact that conveyed everything words couldn't express: gratitude, respect, acceptance, and the absolute trust of a parent sharing responsibility for their child's welfare. Webb's scream echoed off the canyon walls as gravity claimed him. But the sound was already fading as Elias and the alpha raced back toward Hope. The young wolf was stirring when they reached him, his golden eyes opening to find both his fathers watching over him with fierce protective love. The walking stick might be broken, but the spirit it had enabled was stronger than ever. Hope struggled to his feet, supported by human hands and guided by his pack father's encouraging vocalizations, proving once again that adaptation could overcome any limitation, that love could bridge any gap, that families came in forms that evolution had never imagined, but the heart recognized as absolutely true. The new walking stick gleamed in the morning sunlight, its mountain ash surface polished smooth by careful hands that had learned to create tools of hope rather than weapons of war. Elias had carved this replacement during the long nights of Hope's recovery, working by firelight while the young wolf slept off the injuries that had nearly claimed him during the final confrontation with Webb. Each stroke of the knife had been a prayer of gratitude for survival, each curve shaped by love rather than necessity. 3 months had passed since the battle on the ridge, and the mountain valley had returned to the peaceful rhythms that marked the changing seasons. Spring had given way to the full richness of summer, with wildflowers carpeting the meadows in colors that reminded Elias of Sarah's garden and Emma's bright laughter. The pack had reclaimed their territory completely, removing the last traces of Webb's traps and poison stations, restoring safety to paths that had been death-haunted for too long. Hope moved across the cabin's porch with fluid grace, his new walking stick perfectly balanced to accommodate the growth that had transformed him from adolescent to full adult. The blast injuries had healed cleanly, leaving only faint scars that served as reminders of the price he'd been willing to pay to protect his human father. His twisted leg remained as useless as ever, but his adaptation to 3-legged life had reached a level of perfection that made his disability seem like a unique advantage rather than a limitation. The young wolf's latest achievement lay sleeping in the sunny spot. Beside the cabin's front steps, 3 small pups, whose mother was a young female from a neighboring pack. Hope's courage during the confrontation with Webb had become legend among the local wolf population, transforming him from a disabled outcast into a desirable mate whose offspring would carry genes for intelligence, adaptability, and the kind of courage that transcended physical limitations. "Look at them," Elias murmured, settling into his chair with the satisfaction of a grandfather watching new generations discover the world. "3 perfect pups, and not one of them shows any sign of your leg problem. Your children are going to have all the mobility you never had, plus the intelligence you developed to compensate." Hope's tail wagged gently as he watched his offspring explore the safe boundaries of their den area. The pups showed the same golden eyes that marked their father's bloodline, but their movements carried the fluid grace of perfectly formed wolves. They would grow up bilingual in the languages of human and pack, raised by a father who understood both worlds and a mother who represented the pure, wild heritage of their species. The alpha and his mate had become daily visitors to what had evolved into an extended family compound. The great wolf's acceptance of Elias had deepened into something approaching genuine friendship. 2 veterans who'd survived battles that tested the limits of courage and loyalty. His mate had appointed herself grandmother to Hope's litter, bringing gifts of food and teaching maternal wisdom that complemented the unusual upbringing the pups received from their interspecies family. But perhaps the most remarkable development was the growing community that had formed around their mountain sanctuary. Word had spread throughout the regional wolf population about the human who'd fought alongside pack members to defend their territory. Elias found himself hosting delegations of curious wolves who came to observe this unprecedented cooperation between species that had historically been enemies. Some visits were purely social, pack leaders bringing their young to meet Hope and learn from his example of adaptation and resilience. Others carried more serious purposes, wolves seeking medical assistance for injuries that their own healing methods couldn't address, or asking for help in dealing with human encroachment on traditional territories. Elias's veterinary skills had found new purpose in these interspecies consultations. The knowledge he'd thought buried with his old life proved invaluable in treating conditions that purely wild medical approaches couldn't handle. His cabin had become an unofficial wildlife clinic, staffed by a doctor who understood both the medical needs and social structures of his patients. The walking stick served multiple functions in Hope's new role as father and community leader. It provided the stability he needed to keep pace with energetic pups who hadn't yet learned to accommodate their father's different mobility needs. It helped him demonstrate hunting techniques that younger pack members could adapt to their own abilities. Most importantly, it served as a symbol of the possibility that limitations could be overcome through patience, creativity, and the support of family who refused to accept defeat. Hope's parenting style reflected the hybrid nature of his own upbringing. He taught his pups to hunt using traditional wolf methods, but also encouraged them to think tactically about challenges rather than simply relying on instinctive responses. They learned pack loyalty and wild survival skills from their mother and extended wolf family, while their father provided lessons in problem-solving and adaptation that would serve them well in an increasingly complex world. The evening routine in the cabin had evolved to accommodate multiple generations and species. Hope would settle near the fire with his walking stick propped beside him, while his pups explored their indoor territory under the watchful eyes of both human and wolf parents. The alpha and his mate often joined these family gatherings, creating a multi-generational pack structure that honored both traditional hierarchies and new forms of cooperation. Elias found himself reading aloud again, not from veterinary texts, but from Emma's favorite storybooks that he'd preserved through all his years of grief. The young pups couldn't understand the words, but they responded to the rhythm and warmth of his voice, just as Hope had during his own recovery. The stories took on new meaning when shared with this expanded family, tales of courage and adventure that resonated with beings who'd lived their own epic journey from abandonment to belonging. The photographs Webb had taken during his surveillance remained in Elias's possession, but their purpose had transformed completely. Instead of documentation of planned violence, they'd become a record of the family's growth and development, proof of bonds that had seemed impossible but proved stronger than hatred or fear. Hope's transformation from dying pup to protective father was chronicled in images that told a story of resilience and love, triumphing over every obstacle. But the most significant change was visible in Elias himself. The haunted grief that had driven him into 7 years of isolation had been replaced by a quiet satisfaction that came from purpose fulfilled and family protected. His beard remained grey. His hands still bore the calluses of mountain life, but his eyes held the warmth of a man who'd found his way home through the most unexpected journey imaginable. As autumn approached and the first snows began dusting the high peaks, Elias carved new notches in Hope's walking stick, marks that recorded successful hunts, family milestones, and the growing population of the valley's wolf community. Each mark told a story of adaptation and survival, of love that created families from the most unlikely materials, of hope that grew stronger rather than dimmer with the passage of time. The walking stick that had begun as a tool to help a disabled wolf navigate difficult terrain had become something far more significant, a symbol of the possibility that broken things could be repaired, that families could be formed across any boundary, that love could indeed create miracles when nurtured by patience, courage, and the willingness to see strength where others perceived only weakness. Hope's children would grow up in a world where the boundaries between human and wild were less absolute than previous generations had believed. They would carry forward the lessons their father had learned through pain and adaptation, teaching future generations that survival often depended not on individual strength, but on the ability to build bridges across differences that seemed insurmountable. In the distance, wolves sang their ancient songs to the rising moon, voices carrying across valleys that had echoed with violence, but now resonated with the harmonies of an impossible family that had chosen love over fear, cooperation over conquest, hope over despair. The mountain ash walking stick stood ready beside the hearth, polished smooth by use and time, waiting for tomorrow's adventures in a world where miracles walked on 3 legs and love spoke in languages that transcended every boundary except the one that mattered most, the boundary of the heart.